Well, everyone, we'll come back to order. So for our final guest, we have Nancy Elliott. She's going to be talking about mental health in the workplace, the union's role. I have included the complexity of mental illness, the effect of mental illness in the workplace, and unions' role in fighting the stigma, promoting mental wellness for workers, and supporting union members affected by mental illness. So this is quite a topic. I want to thank you for this presentation, and I'll let you have the floor, Nancy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. So thank you very much for having me here this afternoon to speak on this topic. Mental health in the workplace. I think if you've been at work in the last week, you were probably affected by mental health illness or mental illness at one point or another just recently. Just so we can maybe sort of get our minds turned to what we're talking about, why don't we just think about someone you know that has mental illness and just call out what their illness is. You don't have to tell us who it is, just what their illness is. Depression.
Anxiety.
Yeah.
Bipolar disorder. OCD.
Bipolar. OCD, yes. Any others? Pardon? Personality disorders. Eating disorders. Anybody have any others?
Would you consider alcoholism as a mental disorder?
Substance misuse. Yeah, the variety of them, as we'll see. Well, I don't know that we'll actually get to see the whole variety of them today because it would take too long to talk about every single mental illness there is. But I think that is one of the things that makes this a very complex topic, is just how many different forms of mental illness there are, how many different symptoms there can be, manifestations of it, and how each person experiences mental illness in their own way, just as with physical illness. We have two people who have a broken leg. You don't experience the broken leg the same way as the next person, and the same may well hold true for mental illness. So today, what I'm hoping our topics will cover are information about mental health, because the statistics really are quite staggering and eye-opening. Mental health specifically in relation to the workplace, and then we'll get into what the union can do. What can we do? What should we do? So, some facts about mental illness. 1 in 5. Think about that. 20% of Canadians are affected by mental illness in any given year, have a mental illness. And just to put that in perspective, that's 3 times the 2.2 million Canadians who have type 2 diabetes. Almost 5 times the number of Canadians living with heart disease. It's just staggering. And both heart disease and type 2 diabetes are considered epidemics in Canada. So just to tell you how big a problem mental health is. Nearly half of all Canadians will have some form of mental illness by the time they're 40. And the cost to the mental health system and the cost to our benefits plans and the cost to our places are just astronomical. And so that is really why you would want to know about this topic and why you would want to talk about mental illnesses, because it is just so pervasive and affects all of us in so many different ways. So just to start, let's just think about what it means to be healthy. And here's what the World Health Organization says: a complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So just think about how hard that is to attain at any moment. Any moment we're too hot or we're too cold or we don't have enough money for the mortgage, or we're feeling stressed about changes in the workplace. It's really hard to attain perfect health. But without perfect health, as the World Health Organization says, there can be no health without mental health. So then that's what it means to be healthy. What does it mean to be mentally healthy? And mental health is a state of well-being. I've put the sources down there. The Center for Occupational Health and Safety says that it's when someone understands their own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her own community. So that's what we're trying to achieve with mental health, with mental wellness, and that is really difficult. And the reason it is so difficult is because mental health, as I've already mentioned, is complex. It can develop from a combination of genetics and biology and environment and your life experiences. And those life experiences, of course, are going to include things like trauma, death of loved ones, workplace issues, exposure to toxins. There are just so many things that can happen that will affect your mental health. And what makes it really difficult is that the symptoms can vary from day to day, from hour to hour, from minute to minute. Someone can seem perfectly well one moment and not well at all at the next. And then we see they seem perfectly well. They may not be well at all because we can't see it. And we can only understand it by talking to people. The treatment and diagnosis is also really difficult. The diagnosis is especially hard because there's often no objective testing for it. You can't just take a blood test or have an X-ray or an MRI and say, there, that's what's wrong with you. There are some mental illnesses, dementia and that sort of thing, where those tests can give you hints. But not all mental illness are subject to the objective kinds of tests, and we rely a lot on things like the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that they use, that the psychiatrists use, the psychologists use to measure, and basically to ask you questions to try to figure out what is going on. So mental illness is complex by itself, but then when we add the workplace in, that makes it even more complex because we're dealing with two things. We're dealing with mental illness. Those are the illnesses we've actually already talked about, depression and PTSD and anxiety, substance abuse, the things that we've already talked about. But in the workplace, there's also the second thing, and that is the psychological health and safety. And so I'm guessing that everyone here, since you're in a union, since your union reps have all dealt with issues of discrimination and sexual harassment and personal harassment and know how absolutely devastating those things can be on a person's well-being, and how difficult it is to address, how hard it is, how many people, who doesn't know someone who's been off work at least 6 months because of, you don't know anyone who's been off work that long?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, everyone knows someone who's been off work for extended periods because of harassment and discrimination, and they are as big issues of psychological illness, mental health in the workplace as anything else. Which I guess leads to the question, what is the difference between mentally healthy workplace and a psychological healthy workplace? Anyone have any ideas about that? No ideas at all?
Do you have a sense of worth in what you're doing?
That could be. Actually, it's kind of a trick question because the answer is nothing. There are no differences. They're the same high-functioning, respectful workplace if it's a psychological healthy workplace and if it's a mentally healthy workplace. It's exactly the same thing. It's just we sometimes use different terminology. We might talk about a mentally healthy workplace when we're talking about those diagnosed illnesses like depression and PTSD, that sort of thing. We might use psychologically healthy workplace when we're talking about the kind of workplace that is addressing issues of discrimination and harassment and those sorts of things. It's all really on a spectrum, right? So there's this really good picture, I think, that shows you the spectrum. That spectrum, though, I think is just so telling, because every single one of us and every single one of our coworkers and every single one of our members is on that spectrum somewhere during the day. And how hard is it to figure out where they are and what we should be doing to help them? So I think I've already covered the how does it affect you. I'm not so sure that the slide before, when it said healthy, so it had healthy, reacting, injured, ill, that those were really good definitions of the continuum models. I like these ones better, where they're talking about mild disruption, moderate disruption, and severe disruption, because there's no, I don't think there's, you can't say they've gone from being injured to ill. You are injured. If you're injured, you're ill, and you're reacting. So all of those things, we have to be careful about the use of the words on the spectrum and how they affect us. Okay. So then when we start to look at the effect of mental health on the workplace, we know that not only does mental illness help affecting our mental health, it's affecting our physical health also. So it can cause cardiovascular problems. It's been found to be a factor in some cancers. Substance abuse and higher use of alcohol and drugs, prescription and non-prescription, affects our physical health as well as our mental health. And it can even lead to, I think all your health and safety committees have already talked about the fact that it can lead to higher injuries at work, more strain injuries. The better you feel mentally, the less likely you are to have a physical injury. So those connections are sometimes not very intuitive, but they're there. They're proven to be a real factor. Then when we talk, so those are the effects on physical, then we move on to the effects on your cognitive capacities. What's going on with you? And so when we're suffering from mental illness, we're not able to learn as well as we could before. We're not able to cope as easily with change. Things upset us more easily, right? So our memory is affected. So we can't even remember some of the things that we remembered, that we remember when we're functioning at our best. Increased passivity and increased conflict, of course. Conflict, especially when people are mentally ill, there's always increased conflict. And that is something that's really hard for unions to deal with. And then we have all those toxic emotions going on that don't help at all either. So, if we have those effects on the individual, how does that affect the workplace? We have lower engagement, lower productivity, lower creativity and morale. All of those things are not good for employers to have. More people leave the organizations, and I think we see that especially with harassment and discrimination. There's a cycle where people, it's usually the victims of harassment who end up leaving the organization and moving on to something else. We see increased absenteeism, and that's both your days here and there and in the long term. And we see increased in injuries, which we already talked about, more adverse behavioral issues, and heightened conflict, more complaints, more grievances in workplaces that are less well. So added to all of that, there are some other effects of mental illness that we often we hear about, but we hear about it and we think about it briefly, but not for very long. And so I'm hoping we could just spend a couple of minutes on talking about the stigma attached to mental health, to mental illness. So it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in the language we use. I could have easily gotten up here today and told you I had I have a phobia in public speaking. I don't have a phobia. I have I get nervous, as you can tell, but I don't have a phobia. It's not to the level of mental illness. And so if I tell you I'm having a phobia, then am I diminishing someone else's real phobia? I could have told you that the facts and figures that we just talked about were depressing, because they are. They are. They're quite staggering, and they're worrying. But are we diminishing mental health when we use that sort of language? And do we think about that? What do you think? Is this okay? So it's a bit humorous, right? So is it okay? I mean, and is it good to use humor maybe to reduce stigma around some illnesses? I thought this one was pretty union-oriented. So what do you guys think? I mean, really, is it okay? What language do we use, and what should we be using when we talk about mental illness? Someone earlier, I think when someone said addictions, and I said substance misuse, right? Someone earlier this week told me that the word addiction is a word that now has some negative connotation to it, and they prefer the word of misuse, right? And there's some validity to that, but we often don't think about it. We often don't think about it in our workplaces and change, maybe start using those terms ourselves and affect the way that other people use those terms. Then there are all sorts of other assumptions or judgments that are made, and I think we've all dealt with many of those. There are the assumptions that mental illness isn't a real illness. Who hasn't had someone think that their coworker is faking it? Had to deal with union members who think that other union members aren't really suffering mental illness. They're just using it as an excuse. We deal with that on a regular basis, and it's easy to do, really easy to do. I'll just give an example. We had a young man, it's his first job. He comes into the workplace, and he was late the first day, and it just sort of went downhill from there. And he just couldn't get him to work, and they would talk to him and say, you have to show up on time. And so we would try to show up on time, and he'd do well for a few days or even a few weeks. And then finally the employer said, enough, we just can't have you in the workplace. And we're thinking, it's his first job, he's just a kid, he doesn't know, he doesn't have a work ethic. What can we really do? But it turned out that in this particular instance, there was a reason to take a policy grievance. And so we grieved the dismissal, not thinking that we ever wanted this guy back at work. There was a policy reason to take the grievance, and so the grievance was taken. And then a couple of months later, after he's missed his appointments and we're still thinking he's a kind of bit of a loser, he shows up and he says, I know what's going on now. And we end up getting a letter from his doctor that describes the traumatic incident he had as a teenager being assaulted at knife point, and how that has affected his sleep patterns ever since. And so we've made these assumptions about this young worker that turned out to be totally untrue and unkind. And we felt bad about it. Anyway, it turned out we were able to help him at least get the dismissal taken off his record. But it was one of those things where you're going, oh, I just wouldn't even have imagined this turning out this way. And I think that happens to a lot of us. Mental illness can be so frustrating sometimes to deal with, because, people will just not call into work. Like, how can you not just call, just not come to work, not call in? Who does that? Yeah.
I remember dealing with someone, and you believe that they had mental issues, mental illness potentially, right? They were in total denial.
Yeah.
They were in total denial that they had, it's everyone else, maybe, it's not me, da-da-da-da-da-da. So much so that they lost their job, but they would not bring forward medical, they would not see a doctor about their issues. What do you do?
What do you do? What do you do? I'm not going to be able to answer that
Right,
question
no.
for you.
It was a
but,
rhetorical, it's a rhetorical
yeah, it
question.
is. Well, maybe it's not. Anyone have any ideas about what you do in that circumstance? I actually had someone yesterday I was talking about coming to do this. It was a human resource person, and she was telling me about her father who had alcoholism and all the things that she used to go through because of that. And she's reading this book right now where the main focus, where it talks about how it used to be that with alcoholics, we would think that, we need to get them to reach rock bottom, the total rock bottom, lose their job, and that will give them the wake-up call to get the help they need, right? And this book actually says, apparently, I haven't read the book, and I can get you the title later, but apparently the thesis of the book is that actually really isn't helpful to let people hit rock bottom. What's most helpful at all is just to be kind. Just to be kind and try to understand, even though it can be so hard and difficult and frustrating to do. So, along with the stigma and the assumptions and judgments, we have fear. We have coworkers fearing that someone else with a mental illness will be violent or dangerous. And of course, we also have coworkers frustrated when someone's not doing their job because of mental illness and having that workload fall on them. So these are all things that we're trying to deal with in the workplace that makes it so difficult. What makes it even more difficult is that when you have with people with mental illness, and we do have some people, as has just been pointed out, that won't accept that they have mental illness. But even those who know they have mental illness, over half of them don't seek treatment. Over half. That is just amazing. And the reason they don't is because of the stigma and the fear and the fear that people will make assumptions about them.
Nancy, is that clinical? Have they gone to a clinic and had it diagnosed?
No, more than half of people who likely have mental illness don't seek treatment. Do not seek treatment. So they think that the problem is way bigger than what's actually. And I think if we look in our own workplaces, even 20 years ago, we weren't dealing with mental health issues the way we are now. So there's a gradual recognizing of how big a problem it is, how difficult a problem is, and people are starting to talk about it. And we've all heard about Bell's Let's Talk campaign, where you put your picture in the frame on the Facebook page. Is that how it works? and then the whole intent of that is let's talk about mental illness and let's get it out in the open and let's not hide it. Let's not just tell our teenagers who are dealing with mental health issues to just snap out of it. Just pull up your socks. It doesn't work that way. We can't just do it. If it were that easy, then they would have done it already. So that then brings us to the role of the union in mental health issues and dealing with mental health issues. And I'm not sure I've got them all, but I've thought of 3. So the first one, of course, is to raise awareness, talk about it, like we said. The second is to promote good mental health, and the third is to support members who are affected. So we'll just talk about each of those a little bit more. How are we going to raise awareness? We're going to talk openly about mental health, right? We're going to make information available to our members and in the workplace, and we're going to educate union reps the way that we're talking about it here today. The more education, the better we'll be able to deal with these things. And not only do we need to educate our union reps, but our members. So, maybe it's a quote in the newsletter. Maybe it's a little article on harassment. Maybe it's its effects. And maybe it's just a minute at a meeting saying, let's just think about all our brothers and sisters who are off right now with a mental illness. Give them a moment, right? And so if we start talking about it, then that's good. The other thing, I think, is to really start examining ourselves about whether we're making assumptions and judgments and whether we are being kind to those people. It's really sometimes very difficult. But if we just take a moment and think, could I, am I being fair? Did I ask the question when that person, when that youth was not showing up for work, did we even ask him if he had some issues going on that we didn't know about? Or did we just assume that he was just not showing up? So, the union role in promoting mental health, there are a few ways we can do that. We can ensure we have effective health and safety committees. A lot of health and safety committees traditionally have only dealt with physical safety, right? Are the floors even? Are there cords running across the floor? Is there a tripping hazard? That sort of thing. Is the lighting proper? A lot of health and safety committees, psychological health is not really on their radar as far as I can tell from reading some of their minutes. They're dealing with the near misses, where someone almost got hit by a car, but they're not dealing with, we've had 14 complaints of harassment in this department last month. We're not dealing with that. And why aren't we dealing with it? Well, because it's really hard to deal with. What are we going to do, right? But maybe if we start asking questions, maybe if we just point out, hey, we've noticed in your department there are a lot of harassment issues coming forward, or we've had 2 or 3 members mention that there are some difficulties. Maybe we can start getting someone to look at it. And if we say it loud enough and often enough. So we can have, we can work on things in our collective agreements about health and safety, discrimination, personal harassment, and work-life balance. All of that helps, right? All of your provisions that limit overtime, how long you can be on call, how much vacation you get, all of those things are actually contributing to mental well-being. So don't underestimate them when you think another day of vacation or a mental wellness day in your collective agreement. Why not? Even though the employer is not going to agree to have 4 mental wellness days added to your entitlements, or it's unlikely they will, why not just have a discussion about it at the bargaining table? At least it's raising the issue. We can also encourage workable policies and standards. A lot of employers have policies about violence in the workplace, personal harassment, sexual harassment, but we don't take a lot of time to really examine those policies and see whether in those policies there are barriers being created for people to come forward. One example I saw recently is there's a policy that says that they won't accept complaints that are more than 90 days old from the last incident, right? Some people haven't even sought medical treatment in the last 90 days, enough to be able to bring a complaint forward. So those time things are barriers, and it's such a simple thing that we just don't often think about. There's also more recently, and I think it's about, I'm not sure how old it is, but the national standard of Canada for psychological health and safety in the workplace. It's a framework that's been set up. It was set up by a whole bunch of different organizations. I think the CLC was included in it. And it's something that every workplace could actually, there are people now who will come out, consultants who will come help you implement it. But if you have the willpower in your union, you could probably bring it to management yourself. And it's all online. It's all there, step by step, what you would need to do. So that's something that could be looked at by unions. Then there's this, of course, is something that the CCU does on a regular basis, and that's promote social and political models that contribute to good mental health. So all those things, you probably don't even think about it when you're arguing for the $15 minimum wage or the, better housing, those sorts of things. But those things contribute. Your social well-being contributes to your mental well-being. It's all connected: physical, mental, social, right? And so if it's all connected, we need to be paying attention to all of those things. And of course, appropriate access to healthcare is a key factor. So promoting all that is important. And then the last one, supporting members. Well, yes, we have our legal obligations to do that, the duty of fair representation, and we also have human rights obligations. So we have legislation that says that we cannot discriminate against people because of illness and disability, and that includes mental illness and disability. And we have the duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. But aside from that, we're just going to have better workplaces for everyone if we address mental health. It's just the right thing to do. There are a whole host of ways of supporting members affected by mental health issues. Assisting with requests for accommodation, assisting with health and safety, WCB. A lot of provinces actually, their WCB doesn't cover psychological injuries unless they're really severe. In PEI, there was a case a few years ago where the spouse of a man who had been bullied at work to the point that he committed suicide was finally received WCB benefits. And there's a similar story like that in, I think it's Saskatchewan. But generally speaking, most WCB providers don't cover psychological illness. But what if we all started having our members make claims every time there's bullying and harassment in the workplace? Would we get someone to start paying attention to that? Would it be worth pursuing, lobbying for it? I don't know. A lot of our provinces also, our health and safety legislation doesn't cover psychological health. We're seeing it added more and more. New Brunswick, I think, is the most recent province to include psychological health in their health and safety legislation. All that requires them really to do is that employers have to have a policy. In Ontario, they have to have a policy that requires investigations into health and safety claims for harassment. BC, I think, has a pretty good, maybe people here can tell me about BC's health and safety legislation, but it's being incorporated more and more into legislation, but there are still gaps. There's none in Nova Scotia. So the other one, I guess, is just when we're making harassment and discrimination claims, more and more we're seeing courts and arbitrators award big damages for psychological claims. Keys versus Honda is one case, one big case that you've probably heard of. The more that we make the employers where it's hitting their pocketbook, and it's hitting their pocketbook in different ways, the retention, the absenteeism, that way. The more that we're bringing that to the employer's attention, that there's a business case to be made for dealing with these issues, the more likely that we're going to have them dealt with. And then comes probably the area where I do most of my work is in helping members deal with, there's all sorts of difficult issues, but one of them is discipline, of course. Sorry, I'm going to go back here for a second.
Nancy,
yeah.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
You said that arbitrators are more willing
more
to
likely, yes. Well, yes.
To give financial damages to claimants.
Yeah. Well, it's becoming increasingly more common to do so and to give higher awards. So in both human rights tribunals and arbitrators, there are cases now where some employees are not even having to prove, have their doctors testify to prove that there's been harm caused by harassment. It's being recognized that, of course, we can take judicial notice that harm is being caused, and they'll provide damages. It's not that it's still relatively new, but it's becoming more common, and I think that's as those damages rise, employers are going to be more willing to address the issues in a real substantive way.
Which provinces are more?
Which provinces? Yeah. I think you can see it in different provinces across the country. Different cases across the country. It's the cases where it's the most egregious that we're seeing the bigger damages, right? But those will trickle down. It used to, if you look at even human rights cases, it used to be very unusual to get a damage award over $10,000 or $20,000. That's all you could expect if you took a whole claim of discrimination and you proved it. You proved your case that you had that there was discrimination and that you were in a protected class and that there was an adverse consequence to you and that you connected that protected characteristic to the adverse thing that happened to you, and then the employer wasn't able to justify the discrimination that occurred. And so you went through all of that, proving your case, days and days of testimony, and then you would maybe get $10,000 for damages. You might get your job back. You might get a few other, some money for lost wages and that sort of thing. But the amount of wages or amount of damages given just in general damages were quite small. And so, but we're seeing those go up. We're seeing them go higher and higher. Hundreds and thousands sometimes. Then we have the appeal court sometimes knocking them back, as happened in the Honda case. But the more those damages go up higher, the more often higher damages are awarded, the more attention people are going to pay to these sorts of issues. So the other thing that unions help with, of course, is supporting members on a day-to-day basis. And I thought maybe the best way to sort of get at how a union does this, and just to make it a little bit more interesting for you, is I put on your table pieces of paper that have fact scenarios on them about it's a totally fictitious fact scenario, as I said at the top. And I thought maybe if you could just get together at your tables, maybe take 10 minutes, read through the fact scenario, and just figure out how we're going to deal with poor Carl, who's just lost his job and with these mental illness issues involved. And then we'll come back and have a discussion about it.
So here's a question. Carl comes in and kills someone.
You take the grievance off.
Family,
Sure,
can the
right?
family says this scenario, can the family?
What would be the main argument for it?
Actually accommodation for his illness.
For the lawyer.
Not the what if?
I don't know.
So you're, yes, we're following the agreements? Okay. Yeah. On the scenario.
Okay. What legal?
Because you just need a fair rep, right? You need a fair rep. So
The
then,
employer has more. The union.
so it's documented.
And they have expensive lawyers.
The sunset clause, if that would have come out, right? The discipline stuff would have already come out. That's said, right?
Or it should, but it's still laws wiping a claim with that out.
Is that what happened?
Well, they said that under the sunset clause meant that probably cleared his file. But I mean, it's still, clearing the file doesn't necessarily mean that a labor board or human rights isn't going to take that into consideration, because they can't say we didn't know. Even though the sunset clause was there, it was taken out, the workers knew because of the behavior, management knew, and it was documented that he didn't take his meds. So, that would be the argument, one of the main arguments.
So what are the main arguments for?
It was documented previously. Everybody, management, union, and workers knew there was a problem because they talked about it going off before.
So it's documented previously. That's an argument.
And it doesn't look like there's any steps to help him other than getting back on his meds, right? But
So you're saying that the company's not taking making efforts to
there was no accommodation, right?
accommodations. Okay.
There was no assessment, because there probably should have been an assessment. So it's probably different things in different provinces. I mean, that was something, but the other part, accommodation, would have taken potentially away from the other workers and found a spot where you wouldn't get aggravated.
Also, maybe if they heard an apology from Carl, that might go a long way as well. If he is sorry that he threatened them.
Didn't he apologize up in here?
Did he?
I believe he did.
So I think he said the next day. Oh, that's true. Yeah. Okay. Well then.
I think it comes down to the 15 years that he was a paramedic. If they could explain what he might have seen or some of the stuff he's seen.
Yeah, but maybe he also.
What causes him to go on? Well, yeah.
That's kind of signal like.
Yeah, but could they say maybe what they thought was wrong with him to make
Or
him
they
take
could
the
just
meds?
do a session on PTSD or the PPWC, right? And just a general session on that, and maybe people start to clue in.
Anyone think that that plays into it at all?
Why wasn't he taking the meds?
Well,
I mean, we just spent the morning talking
They were probably
about
too
how we
expensive.
don't.
because there's no pharmacare program. And he couldn't afford it. Well, it's possible.
They're cheap.
It's possible. So the reason why he wasn't taking his meds may be a really important factor here that we don't know yet.
Right.
Why that happened.
The meds could have, if they're they could have side effects that really inhibit him from doing other things. So maybe there's reasons why he is not taking the meds. What did they do to accommodate him? It seemed they kept him in the same area with the same coworkers. Is there another building at the university that Carl could be a cleaner at where he works basically alone so nobody has to be afraid of him? Did they accommodate him to undue hardship or at all?
Right. So I take it then the general consensus is we're going to file a grievance. We're going to say that the employer should have put in place different accommodations, should have been a little bit more understanding and creative in its accommodations, tried a few different things because accommodation, of course, is a trial and error kind of thing. And so we've won our arbitration and now Carl's coming back to work. Now what? What are we going to do with our coworkers who they just don't want Carl there? What are we going to do?
Well, yeah, there's education for both Carl and for his coworkers and for management.
And so how are we going to do that education, I guess, is
Well, there has to be, you have to protect Carl's privacy rights, and so there has to be a discussion with the coworkers about just how Carl may or may not react to certain situations. But again, maybe, like Mike said, take him out of that situation, put him somewhere else, and also get him off the night shift. I mean, this is a university, so it's not a very small employer. So they have more options than a smaller employer, let's put it that way.
But if we put him on days, now he's working, directly with students.
Not necessarily.
It's on the building.
It does depend on the building, I suppose, if they put him in there.
And this is his second outburst in 18 months. So we're not saying that he's having these outbursts every single day. So for him to go back to where he's working, I mean, you just have to, education's the big piece here, right? Education not only for him, like if you're starting to feel stressed, remove yourself from the situation, go away from people and kind of have your little moment away from everybody. And then, but it's also educating the people around him and having lunch and learns or whatever about mental health first aid or psychological first aid, whatever in the workplace. And just, I think education's a big piece for sure.
And what about the threat that he made?
That's definitely again. He could have meant he was going to leave a bucket there for her. He didn't say he was going to hurt her.
Oh, I see.
He could return the dirty bucket the next day for Lisa.
I mean, I think what's really encouraging here is that you are also willing to give the benefit of the doubt to Carl, and you're also willing to say all we need to do is educate our members to accept him back in the workplace, and the employer, for that matter, to accept him back in the workplace. I'm not sure that if we'd presented this scenario 5 years ago, we would have had such a consensus in the room. Right? And I added on that question at the end, does it make any difference for you to know that Carl was a paramedic before he started working for the university? Did that make a difference to you?
No, I don't think so.
It didn't make any difference?
I think it does.
It maybe explains something, but it doesn't change how I approach it.
Probably has PTSD.
And maybe that dirty bucket is a trigger for blood and guts and gore for when he was a paramedic that maybe he's flashing back to, I don't know.
It's possible.
Could be a whole bunch of
But
reasons.
I think what's important here is that he has a doctor, he has medication. What does the doctor say his accommodation should be?
Well, the
with
doctor
respect to
hasn't- he just said we can expect.
Right. But the doctor would know potentially, or the doctors would know about PTSD. The doctors would know about the meds. Then the doctors could put it all together. Where us as union people would just have to take, what is that list of accommodations that Carl needs?
Really, what my real question there about asking, if you knew he was a paramedic, how many of you did that make you sympathize with him even more? It's so much easier, isn't it, when we can know there's a cause.
The more you know, the more sympathetic you get in all cases.
Right.
And this is just another fact that allows you to know more.
It does. And see, the doctor didn't say what Carl's illness was, just said he had an illness, caused him to act out. And, of course, employers aren't necessarily entitled to know a diagnosis, and so the employer may not have known any of that background. Well, they might have known from his resume, but they might not have known any of that background. And people sometimes don't ask. And Carl, to me, is a pretty sympathetic character. He worked as a paramedic. He's now working nights. It's a hard job, physical job. He's obviously had some issues happen with his life that he's you just automatically know. But what happens when we don't know the backstory? Or what happens when the person telling us the backstory is someone we just don't like, right? Someone who we just can't get it, what they're telling us, or we just don't want to believe it, or they've called us for the 14th time this week to tell us of this little incident that happened in the workplace that to you seems like nothing, but for them, they need to tell someone right now about it. And, how often does that happen and we just brush it off? I think that's where, when you have something like this that's so concrete, it's so much easier to deal with than when you have the other issues of people, who have, you can't point to PTSD. You can't point to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things happening in the workplace, but the person still has all that trauma, all those debilitating thoughts, and sooner, and has taken sick leave and has come back, and things are just sort of escalating. Those are the really, really hard ones to deal with. So anyway, just to finish up here, what would happen with discipline is arbitrators, they'll apply this test. It's out of a case known as Canada Safeway from 1999, but it's been quoted in several cases even as recently as, I know of one a couple of years ago, or a few years ago in the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia where it was mentioned. And basically what they do is they look at the illness, or they want to verify there is an illness, then they want to say that whether there's a link between the illness, and then is the link sufficient to render the conduct less culpable. Okay, so that link is sometimes really hard to make. So when we have the teacher who is maybe taking photographs of their students surreptitiously, and the teacher says, well, I have depression and that's what's led to my behavior. And it's really hard to make that connection, that nexus from one to the other. That's where these cases sometimes fall apart for unions. It doesn't mean that it's not true. It's just really hard to make the nexus, to provide the evidence, right, that you need. And of course, we're not very sympathetic to that story either. We don't want that teacher to necessarily be found not culpable for that conduct, because those are our daughters and our children that we're talking about. So, and then the last part of that test that they'll use is whether the employee has been rehabilitated, and so that's sometimes really a question when alcoholism has caused adverse behavior in the workplace. Maybe it's led to theft or something like that. Is the employee able to show that they've been rehabilitated through attending meetings and getting counseling, that sort of thing? They might some other arbitrators. I just added it on there because some arbitrators don't take that first approach and instead use the more traditional approaches. They just approach it like a disciplinary case. Was there conduct? Are there exculpatory factors that we should look at? That sort of thing. And then they'll apply as a secondary analysis, is there some sort of duty to accommodate an illness? So either way, it should come out the same, right? It should come out to the same result. So I don't know that it matters that much. The member-to-member conflict, I mean, we talked about that, what we were going to do for Carl's co-workers. So we have duties to those members too, right? The members who are afraid have a right to a safe and harassment-free workplace. They have a right not to be subjected to those rages that Carl goes into. And so we do have to try and address those conflicts. It's harder because we have, it's so much easier when we can just be making our complaint to the employer and not taking into account these competing interests among members. We can talk about those member-to-member conflicts all day and how difficult they are to deal with. But one suggestion that I have is that maybe we talk about using some alternative dispute resolution. Maybe we have talking circles, restorative justice circles, facilitated talks, the education that you suggested. So those sorts of things.
Amongst their own group.
Yeah. Maybe amongst our own group, maybe with the employer, either way. It's going to depend on the circumstances, because there are some that we're all, we might be able to deal with on our own. There are some that are far more complicated, where we might want to bring in a facilitator. Some where when we're personally involved in some way, we've been dealing with Carl for a year now and working on his case, and we've really gotten to know him, and we know he's a great guy and that sort of thing. Well, am I now the best person to be trying to talk to the other coworkers because now I'm seeing Carl's viewpoint, maybe not seeing their viewpoint as strongly as well as I should. So we might need to bring in a facilitator for that, or someone
when I
more
read
objective.
That's what I saw too.
Yeah.
Because I'm living it. I live it all the time. Member-on-member conflicts.
They're really difficult.
Yeah,
so
they are very difficult.
That's really all I had in the way of a formal presentation. But if there's some information you can seek out online. But if anyone has questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. So,
in terms of language in contracts on how to deal with mental illness, have any contracts really tackled the issue? Is there any language out there that unions can direct locals to, or?
There is an organization, I always get the name of it wrong. I think it's in BC, headed up by Wolfgang. Anyway, this name will come to me. They have clauses for accommodation that they suggest people put in their collective agreements. And so you can see that they're mostly surrounding accommodation, and then there'll be harassment procedures, but there aren't usually, there's not usually much more than a definition, and then you go to the manager of the person who, you go to your manager or the manager of the person who did the harassment, and then you go, that doesn't resolve it, we'll go to the next person. I mean, it's more like a process, and it doesn't really talk about the kind of workplace that you want to have. And so actually, NSUPE Local 14 is about to go into collective bargaining, and they have, they're proposing a whole new raft of language surrounding equity, discrimination, workplace violence, and harassment, sexual harassment, and we could maybe share what their proposal is going to be after we start bargaining. We can share that proposal. It's
Was that language drafted by council?
there was some help with that, yes. And anyway, we're really eager to see how the employer receives that language, because the Halifax Public Library has these principles, I guess, or what do they call them, Shelby?
Oh, is it values?
Their values, yes, respect in the workplace and I guess they're very nice sounding values. What we want to do is transfer them into real concrete things. And so even having the collective agreement say, this workplace doesn't tolerate harassment from anyone. We don't tolerate it from the public. We don't tolerate it from our own members, and we don't tolerate it from service providers. And there can be repercussions. But then it also sets out a whole bunch of different ways of dealing with the harassment. As simple as all we want you to do is tell someone about it, and that's all you have to do. You don't have to do anything else. Just tell someone about it. We're just going to keep track of the incident, and once a year or twice a year, our health and safety committee is going to just look at that pattern or see if there's a pattern, and if there are suggestions we can make for improving the workplace. So we're hoping that we'll see some real change come out of that. We're really looking forward to seeing how the employer receives it.
You go ahead.
So at York University, they have a workplace violence policy as well as a harassment policy for the whole university. And they've just updated their healthy workplace policy to include psychological wellness in the workplace, which is awesome. That came forward as a recommendation from our Joint Health and Safety Committee. But also at York University, the York University Staff Association that we're a part of, we are the only union group on campus that has any sort of health and safety language in our collective agreement.
Wow.
Which is awesome. But as we're in bargaining right now, and we've kind of, for 3.5 days, we just talked about health and safety with the employer.
Did that include psychological health and safety?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
But because it's already in the workplace policy,
You don't need it.
we don't need it in the collective agreement. Yeah.
So I work for Children's and Women's Hospital. We're bargaining right now as law for all of BC. I'm not sitting at bargaining or in the process of doing it right now. We also have policies for harassment, bullying, all that. We already have those policies written. But we are in the collective agreement, we're adding mental health training for the shop stewards and the Josh committee members. So all those people are going to be trained up to understand mental health issues, to deal with those issues on the site, which is going to be on our collective language. So I'm happy about that. Actually.
Yeah, I think the employers that are initiating those sorts of education programs and the mental wellness first aid it's just highly commendable, and we should really encourage our members to take full advantage of it. Anytime I've heard someone take the courses, they've come out of it so much better prepared to deal with all the illnesses that they need to deal with.
Are those courses online?
I actually don't know. We'd have to do a search for them. I'm not sure that I've seen them. In fact, I only know of one employer that's aside from the ones that you've mentioned, only one of the employers I deal with that I know of does mental first aid in the workplace for all its employees, and that's the library again. So I don't know, do they do it at HRM now? And if you read, there are lots and lots of policies like that, that if you just read the policy, you can identify almost immediately some difficulties with it, right? You can have a witness there, but not a union rep, right? And the witness isn't allowed to speak. So right away, that's a real problem, isn't it? An inequality of trying to deal with it. You have to have a written response in 10 days if you've been, those sorts of things. Some people can't do a written response. It's just, it would take them forever to write out all the things that they're thinking, and they're supposed to be doing it in their own words. They're supposed to, attend interviews and be questioned about these things without actually knowing the accusations before they go into the meeting, right? So is that fair and appropriate and a good way to deal with harassment and all the triggers of mental health that go with harassment? Probably not. So those are actually, policy development is an area that I'm really pretty interested in, and would love to see some sort of committee form to do, a model policy that we think would work. So.
Yeah, we have a harassment policy for member, and what we do is advocates for both sides. And not that, one thing that strikes me here, and I'm not sure because I haven't been through it myself, is it strikes me that a lot of harassment probably has mental health issues attached to it. And I'm just not sure if that's
right.
in the training.
I think that's something that, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg thing. Did the harassment trigger mental health difficulties, or did mental health difficulties trigger the harassment? And do we need to sort that out? Do we need to? Can we? I mean, that's very complex and hard. So if anyone has the answer to that, well, you could make millions. Write a book, make millions. Yes, so often you do, as union reps, it's our job, right, to advocate for our members who have sometimes done some terrible things. And do we take the time to, it's just like a defense attorney, really. Are we helping to create a situation that will make things worse for other people? And, and how do we address that? Do we count on the system the way that we count on the criminal justice system? There's a reason we have those procedures and processes in place to protect our freedoms and due process and all that. And sometimes maybe we do too much, right? So I don't know the answer to your question, because anyone who was helping Carl where that happens is then going to be second guessing themselves pretty seriously, I would think.
Well, Lisa could have been one of the co-workers indicating that she feared for her life.
She probably was. She probably, we didn't really get into Lisa's role and whether she did it on purpose or whether it was a mistake or whether, one of her kids called sick and she had to leave work in a hurry or whatever. Who knows what was going on with her too. And who knows those other workers, what if they had a traumatic event? What if they were victims of domestic abuse? And that's why they're so afraid when Carl goes off in these rages, right? There are so many scenarios that we could just go, what if all the time. We have to deal with what's in front of us and what we do know, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep asking questions and being alert and on the lookout, I guess.
In Newfoundland and Labrador, the largest public sector union is NAPE, Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Public and Private Employees. And back in September, they drew up preemptive mental health legislation. And that's for NAPE workers who often find themselves in violent, threatening, horrific situations at work. And what the legislation outlines is, in case of these people who have these instances at work, the legislation outlines all the help that's there for them.
It helps them navigate
Yes.
through the process. Yet actually, an office like that has recently been set up in Nova Scotia for government workers, for NSGEU and includes non-union workers, was set up through the government and the NSGEU jointly. And I think it has 5 staff members, and 3 of them are to help people navigate through all the different mental health, mostly health providers, healthcare providers, I think. But it must also help them, get in touch with their union and that sort of thing, and deal with their claims for LTD too.
Yeah, this is called specifically preemptive mental health legislation.
Yeah. Sounds like something to lobby for in every province.
We have in our benefit plan, we have an EFAP program with 24-hour assistance where someone actually will answer the phone. If you're in immediate danger, they'll have someone right away. So it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah, EFAP is a really good program, and of course, I think most union reps do. I should have mentioned it earlier, but it is a tool that union reps can refer people to EFAP. Obviously, we're not trained mental health workers, and we can't do psychotherapy ourselves with our members. Well, we could try, but it probably wouldn't be very effective. And so EFAP is actually a really good option for us. And you're right, it's something to always keep in mind.
Not only the members can call when they're in need an assistant, the supervisor or the steward workplace reps can call and say, I've got this situation going on in my workplace. I'm concerned about Larry and what's going on with him. So they'll give the union reps advice on how to deal with the situation.
That is actually really. Does anyone else have EFAP programs that do that? Yeah.
We've got it so that like a job steward can actually call the EFAP and talk to a psychologist on how to deal with the person on the job site.
That's excellent. Actually, we should all check into whether our EFAP providers will do that, because that would be a really good tool to offer to union advocates and stewards.
Yeah, in our situation, we're the ones that have the contract with the provider. Mm-hmm. So we ask them to put that in the contract. In other situations where you're going through the employer's program, maybe you would have to convince them to post that.
Sounds like a collective bargaining topic to me. It could easily be. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Can I just also another website that is great for information is redcross.ca, the Canadian Red Cross, and because they've just created this new psychological first aid program. Yeah, it's awesome.
Good. Well, thank you, Nancy.
Thanks very much.
I appreciate it. We have a gift for you for taking the time to come and give us this invaluable conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
We appreciate everything you did today.
Thank you.
Thank you.